Hey everybody, Ryan here. Welcome back finally to Plague Scythe Studios. I have managed to temporarily escape the clutches of the never-ending game known as Elden Ring to hunker down for a couple of days and finish this video once and for all. It's been in the works longer than the last couple hour-long sprees. Today we have over 20 minutes of raw demonstrations and tentatively another 20 minutes or so for the inevitable part 2. That's because today we are pitting out the Fractal Audio AX8, a piece of equipment that has accounted for literally dozens of videos on my channel, with its successor, as of 3 years ago, the FM3. Now, a few videos back, I made kind of a brief exploration guide into some of the new tones and sounds and configurations that you can make with the FM3, FM9, and AX8 firmware. There's a lot of new models, a bunch of the blocks got completely overhauled, and of course some of those effects are going to carry over today. But for the sake of this demonstration and comparison, we're basically going to pretend that the only models that exist are those that are on the AX8. So we're not going to be delving into any of that new stuff. You can check out that video if you haven't seen it and are interested. Today specifically, we're going to pit the dry sounds of the AX8 versus its younger brother, the FM3, to see what's improved. Can we even tell a difference? And if there are differences, are they worth upgrading for? I'm really hoping to answer a couple questions with this mini-series. First of all, it's to satisfy my morbid curiosity about just how much better does this new generation of firmware, this new generation of hardware sound versus the trusty AX8 and AX8 generation. But more importantly to me is if you're someone that still uses this now kind of aging hardware, but you're happy with your sound, what are you missing? What in a controlled environment sounds different? And even if it does sound different, does it sound better? What can you expect by upgrading platforms, and is it worth it? Now, I know not all of you have the time to dilly-dally and want to get straight into it, so down below there's going to be timestamps with all of these shootout portions that will be comparing the amplifier, drive, and compressor blocks between these two devices. The next video is going to focus on the wet effects, so you could kind of classify compressor as wet, some of the other stuff is dry. It's how I sort it out in my head. Regardless, if you didn't skip directly to the guitar audio, then I assume you at least care a little bit about the testing methodology and my mindset when creating these shootouts. So first things first, the FM3 was used as the reference because this is the firmware I've been playing on the most in the past year or so between the FM3 and the FM9. With that said, I did stick with a few limitations that I hinted at the beginning of the video. First of all, no new models. If the model does not exist on the AX8, I'm not showing you here. The models that I chose across the drives, compressors, and the amplifiers are those that aren't necessarily the most common things or ones that I think, represent the kind of amps that everybody's going to be using, but they're ones that are very unique to Fractal firmware. It's not to say they're not modeled anywhere else, but I didn't just pick, the Plexi. I didn't just pick the Fender Blackface. I picked those that are within those families, but Fractal Audio kind of has the sole place to get that tone. Something like the Cameron amplifiers or the Morgan amplifiers or the Carol Ann's. Those kind of things that when I think Fractal Audio amp modeling, that's what I think of. Now, this self-imposed limitation has some interesting consequences for all these tests because every one of these require the cab block. Of course, we want to have a complete guitar sound, right? So for the cabinet block, I obviously don't have that pre-amplifier functionality included because the AX8 doesn't have it. Also have the low and high cut set to where that's not influencing the sound at all. But with the impulse responses, I chose to use the stock legacy cabs, those that you would also find in the AX8. Now, I could have loaded up any third-party IR I wanted, any of mine, what have you, but I wanted to use those that the Fractal Audio Wiki kind of recommends you pair with these amplifiers, or at least generally in that ballpark, and have sounds that you can get in the box on both devices. Now, with that said, across all the tests, not necessarily going for the prettiest or the gnarliest or the best guitar tone out of any of this. What we're trying to gauge is how close does the AX8 respond to the FM3. Speaking of firmware, the FM3 was recorded using the latest release 5.00. There is like a 5.02 public beta, and I believe a 5.04 in the works to reflect some of the changes on AX8 in 19.04 on that platform. So this is probably not going to be the most up-to-date by the time you watch it in a month or so, for those of you coming to this video later, but the major changes are already on here. From here, it's kind of gravy as far as I can tell with a lot of these things. There's some new updates to power amp modeling and a few specific tweaks on 1904. But for the most part, the big changes with Cygnus you're going to hear on this, as well as some of the other drive and compressor optimizations. The Fractal AX8 by default is left on its old, 10.0 firmware that was last released in like 2018. Whatever that is, that's what it's on. And this is, of course, still the quantum generation. Even AX8 2 got a little bit of the Aries modeling, though it didn't receive its full suite of features. So we're really looking at something like a generation and a half gap between these two devices when it comes to amp modeling specifically. The drive modeling and compressor modeling is also kind of interesting on the FM3 because this is running the latest Fast Spice version, which is more of like a dedicated component-based modeling, sort of like the amplifier blocks now. It's supposed to be more accurate, faster, and even less heavy on a lot of the more complicated circuits when it comes to processing power. Whereas my understanding is that the older firmware on stuff like AX8 2 and AX8 is more of a basic wave shaper function that is closer, but a little more clunky and prone to errors and aliasing. So that'll be interesting to see how those stack up. Not to mention the whole host of modifications you can do on this platform that you can't there, like swap out individual diodes and such. We won't be going into that. The compressor block also got an overhaul that makes some of the models not quite one-to-one. With all this stuff, there will be minor tweaks to try to bring them a little bit more in line, and I just chose the ones that were as close as I could get, or the ones that you could tell replaced the old models. But for what it's worth, most of the software still lines up. Whatever models you really covet on the AX8, you're going to find them on the FM3. They just might be a little tweaked and maybe named slightly differently. I guess the last thing people would be asking is, why FM3 versus AX8? Why not AX8 2 versus AX8 3? If I had the whole separate conversation with that. Or specifically, why not AX8 versus FM9? Yeah, I've had this for close to 5 months now. Just as a sidebar, I'm not going to review this until they actually make more of them. I feel like I'm part of a very fortunate few who have it's not a pre-release product. It's not even in beta. It's a really great finished product, but chip shortages and all that, kind of hard for me to talk about something that I can't tell you to go buy. So there's that. But I think despite my feelings about the FM3 being a side grade with a lot of upgrades over the AX8 software-wise, it does make for a great controlled comparison, because though I feel the FM9 is the true spiritual successor to what the AX8 was going for, the FM3 manages to pack a lot of extra functionality through software with pretty much the same horsepower and indeed about the same I/O, which makes this extremely handy for the shootout purposes. First of all, the input circuitry is basically identical, whereas the AX8 3 and FM9 have this variable impedance and even capacitance input circuit. This is fixed, so it's like plugging into just a straight buffer. You can modify some stuff on the larger platforms that make your guitar react differently, like you're plugged into a fuzz pedal or a 10-foot long cable. This is, you get what you get. You have an input pad setting. That's it. So we can isolate that, set those identically, we're good to go. They also both have SPDIF outs, just like all their big brothers do. So that eliminates a digital to analog conversion. And with the reamping process, just took my DIs straight to the radial reamp box, going back into whatever device, the FM3 or AX8, out SPDIF, back into the interface, voila, we're done. And basically, minus whatever very slight input-output hardware changes and coding there is between the two devices, we're hearing purely software differences, which is exactly what I wanted for this video. So with that, let's roll on to our first comparison. the amplifier block. Some things that should be mostly apparent in the video when you see FM3 edit with the blue background. That is this guy. AX8 edit with the more green tinge space. That's this guy. You'll also see that for the most part, the basic page, the drive, bass, middle, treble, master volume, presence, depth, all that stuff will look pretty much the same, if not exactly the same between the two units, because most of the under the hood changes that I made to bring this more in line with the FM3 lie in parameters like negative feedback or the speaker impedance curve. Again, we use this as the reference, but as you'll notice over the years, they tend to change negative feedback values, or at least where they default to. Their recommended speaker model, so I went in here and tried to match the values as close as I could. Now, I did tweak after that. If it still didn't sound anywhere near it, and you'll hear a couple segments in here where you probably guess which ones they were, then I'd go over and, try to make bigger moves like, changing the tone stack or maybe turning up the input drive or things like that, just to bring it more in line. But for the most part, I'm not going in here and making any crazy changes. You're not going to see any of the cutoff frequencies changed from the default values or any like graphic or parametric EQs between the pre and power amp. We're trying to isolate some of the variables in here, but for a lot of the advanced parameters that still existed back then on this, just trying to bring them more in line with one another. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty much amplifier through the same cab block, and any other changes would be something as simple as like a volume boost up front or a EQ with like the rectifier example. So we should be pretty much hearing some raw amplifier tones minus some very low in the mix reverb on some of the clean stuff because it just sounded weird without it otherwise. So let's kick it off and we'll talk about how I feel about it at the end. A few months back, Fractal Audio owner Cliff Chase posted a small series of forum posts that shot out a real amplifier, a presumably Fractal Audio device, and some other competing devices labeled brand L and brand N that got some mixed responses. A lot of people thought they could point out which was which and which one was a real amp and which one was a Fractal one. A lot of people, though, couldn't tell the difference between any of them, or even the ones that did sound obviously remarkably different to Cliff, at least. And at some point during those threads, he posted something along the lines of, why do I even, spend the time busting my ass to make these things react more realistically when you guys can't even tell the difference? And there's some valid sentiment behind that statement, but let me at least be the one to say it has not gone unnoticed, okay? I'm not gonna blow smoke up Fractal Audio Systems' ass and tell them that I think this firmware and that the AX8 generation is just miles better. In fact, I think if anything, I've been saying the exact opposite since the release. We have gotten way past the 80 for 20 point where any little minor change is probably going to add up to something, but it's going to take a lot of those things in very specific scenarios for them to come out and be noticeable. You can hear a lot of those specific scenarios and amp models that have been affected by the ongoing Cygnus updates and all of the great things that the Fractal Audio team is doing. Specifically with like the higher gain stage amplifiers, that visceral tube crunch is far more present. The low end doesn't sound nearly as artificial. By comparison, the AX8 doesn't sound bad even when you put it next to a real amplifier, but when you put them next to each other, wow, like some of that stuff is really overbearing on the AX8. Now you can dial it out, but it's still, what you get when you dial in those settings out of the box. So I think you ultimately arrive at a more realistic and better tone more quickly on the FM3 for a lot of this stuff. Now, for some of the more mid-gain or especially low-gain, cleaner, chimier amplifiers, I could not give a damn less. They sound more or less identical. Of course, there's going to be some harmonic differences, and I'm sure the way that they've changed the cathode algorithms and the power amp handling, all of those things will add up to a product that is greater than the sum of its parts. But I think it's really going to be dependent on which amplifier model you use and honestly, what combination of impulse responses you use. Because for a lot of this stuff, I think I could have changed the IR or done a low or high cut and got them even closer. But this is just what we're hearing raw out of the box. Now, if that said, it doesn't mean I necessarily liked the FM3 better than the AX8 in every single scenario. I just think it reacts more like the real amplifier with some of my own brief experimentations there as well. Now, there were a couple oddballs with the FM3 amplifiers where they were just either like so dark or so mid-rangey compared to the AX8 that nothing would dial those out, sans, including an EQ somewhere. But for the most part, I think the trend has been more accurate low end, more transient, a tighter, better feeling response. And you'll hear on a lot of these higher gain amplifiers that high end sizzle is kind of muted on the FM3. Now, for some amplifiers, it kind of blends right in and sounds authentic because of it, like the rectifier, but stuff like the Ingalls Savage and even some of the more British-inspired Marshall-sounding stuff, all of that going away, which I presume is a result of all of the Cygnus upgrades, it does make the AX8 sound kind of digital by comparison, which is another non-descriptive term I hate, but you hear some of that top end and it's almost like white noise, like it's an output that has nothing to do with the input, and it kind of has that Pod X3 top end sizzle. Now, of course, again, go in and dial a lot of that out, but I think because they've gotten a hold on that and it does sound more natural on the top end on a lot of these extreme amplifiers, that you don't have to do things like a really steep high cut, and you can get just closer out of the box that way. Now, there's already some amps on the AX8 that I think were scary close, and I couldn't differentiate on recording, like the Mark series. Putting the Mark IV model next to my real amplifier, turning some knobs, I could not tell the difference once they were put into there. And I think it kind of is going to depend on the situation. This is something that has it's such a complicated circuit that I think a lot of these improvements just aren't going to show up. and be as noticeable in something like that. But you got amplifiers like the Camerons, or even things like the Diesels that are, by comparison, a little more streamlined. And I think those are situations where you start to hear some more of these differences. And I think at this point, that is very much what we should expect. I'm not expecting every single firmware update, or even if there's going to be a Generation 4, to be just a complete revolution. You know, this is very much an evolution. So it doesn't surprise me that we're hearing improvements, but it also doesn't surprise me that the AX8 and by extension AX2 is still totally usable. There is nothing wrong with them. They just don't react exactly how, you know, a real tube amplifier does, and neither does this yet, I'm sure. With that said, I have no problems with still using the quantum stuff. I'm actually more familiar with it, so I kind of know the tricks of the trade a little better, whereas plugging into this, it's kind of done, you know, out of the box. So I'm still more willing and comfortable using the AX8 as a digital tool, as kind of a distortion generator, or kind of an all-in-one sound in terms of a device, whereas this is getting to the point where it's just like plugging into a digital rig. And I don't want to even change any of the advanced parameters with the amp block. So that will probably inspire people to use them differently. This next segment concerns the other dirt block within the AX8 and FM3, and that is, of course, drive. Now, this one was a little more tricky to set up because, number one, there are far less models on the AX8 than there is on FM3 nowadays. So I'm limited to just 8 that I chose. Of course, there are way more than 8 on the AX8, but these are kind of covering the main ground, the fundamental circuits, and the way that I think a lot of people would use them. So I think this kind of gives you a decent glimpse into how these machines would react differently. But also because this isn't just about the drive block, because most people, you know, maybe except for bass players, aren't just going to be using a drive pedal into a cab, or especially not DI. Again, except maybe a bass player. So by the nature of this test, you're not only going to be hearing the qualities of the drive pedal and the modeling that concerns those drive pedals, but also the modeling of the amplifier that it's going into and the interaction between the two. Because I could absolutely isolate all these variables, right? I could record the just DI track of only the drive pedal and pump it into a real amplifier, or even back right into one of these devices. But no one's going to do that. You know, the whole point of something like a multi-effects unit, like an FM3 or a pod or a Kemper, all this stuff is supposed to be kind of used as an all-in-one device. So if you need a drive pedal, no one's going to just use this, except maybe in 4-cable method, just as a drive pedal. So with the way people are actually playing through these, I don't think it makes sense from a practical standpoint to isolate that particular variable. It would be purely academic at that point. With that said, you are probably going to hear some differences that we might chalk up to the drive pedal, but it's probably actually the amplifier doing it, and we just simply can't distinguish between it. But hopefully, at least most of these tests, you'll be able to tell which is which. As such, we're going to have a clean pedal platform using the Band Commander model. This is going to be for more like the vintage Tube Screamer, transparent overdrive, stuff like the fuzz face treble booster. Then we're going to have a dirt platform with classic JCM 800 for more classic rock and borderline hard rock heavy metal stuff like hard clipping pedals, and of course my favorite Boss SD1. So let's have a listen here and see if one pulls ahead of the other. This test, of course, is nowhere near comprehensive. Still, in my opinion, based off of my experience of swapping between the units, the bigger deal when it comes to the drive block has to do with the added selection of models and the increased tweakability when it comes to the FM3 than it does the actual quality. I'm definitely all for the upgrades, and there are definitely instances where you can hear some of that, again, another theme from the prior block on the AX8, that raspy, fake-sounding high-end by comparison go away with the FM3, and that is appreciated. You can definitely hear that more on the high-gain side than you can on the edge of breakup and the more vintage stuff, but I think that also has to do with the complexity of the circuits. With the JCM 800, you could absolutely hear a few differences even with the pedals disengaged, so you have to take that into account. But again, we are talking about this as a sum of its parts and as a full package. So even if the drive block didn't change at all, there's still an element of the amplifiers being able to handle them better, which is still a good thing and definitely reflects the performance of the drive block. So even if you're someone that doesn't usually use overdrive pedals, it's probably going to be easier on you on the FM3 and get better results. Going through a clean pedal platform, especially these relatively simple circuits like a, one transistor treble booster or a 2 transistor fuzz face, a lot of that stuff you're just not going to be able to hear a lot of big differences between these platforms when you set them the same. Even stuff like a blues breaker or a tube screamer that, are soft clipping and they're not doing a whole lot circuit wise either. Definitely not going to be a make or break going between the two platforms. It's when you start cascading these really driven hard clipping circuits onto tube circuits, or even a bunch of tube circuits on top of a tube circuits, in the case of the Butler tube drive pedal, then that's where I think you'll start hearing some of those appreciable differences. In short, if you fall into the kind of typical ranges of how these pedals are used, especially when it comes to soft clipping overdrives, whether you are a metal player that boosts your amp with the typical 0, 10, 10 settings, or you're a dad rocker who plays your, classic rock with a little bit of dirt and, you put that through a plexi, you're probably not going to hear a major difference going between the two platforms. It's really in these edge cases and where you start stacking distortion where things are probably going to matter more. So that leaves us with one more segment today, and that is compression. I put this at the end because this is the topic that I trust myself the least on. Not because I don't know how they work on a technical standpoint or even the ones that I prefer in a mix. It's that with guitars, I tend to not like compression. I think I've said that 10,000 times on this channel, mainly because of the feel differences. Now, I could dial it in and get satisfactory sounds, but I like things like transformer saturation. I like things like multiband compression better than I do broadband compressors. I really wish Fractal would put these compressors and a lot of their effects into VST plugins. I would absolutely love to use these things in a mix without having to route a device in an SPDIF loop, but that's a conversation for another day. Regardless, this is a topic that I feel I'm the least qualified on. I have a really, I think, strong ear for distortion, not so much for dynamic range manipulation, because it all just sounds worse to me when you start compressing things. With that said, I still try to put a couple scenarios that I think people would most likely use the compression block. I'm not exploring any of the mixes. A lot of the times I would prefer to use like a 80% or 70% mix in front of an amplifier if I had to go that route. Most of the stuff is just going to be, full bore. So let's have a listen to compression both before the amplifier block and after the amplifier block to get two different results. One, of course, being more of trying to stay on that line between clean and edge of breakup to change the distortion character of an amplifier. Barely distortion at that point. And then the other one is post amplifier to get kind of a straight to CD playing through a recording kind of sound. So a couple interesting things to take into consideration when evaluating the results of that last test. First of all, just like with the drive blocks, you have the interaction of the amplifier, so the results are only going to be as good or as consistent as these two amplifier blocks are. And with that, that brings dynamic range changes between both of them. In fact, looking at that last test that uses the SLO, the FM3 already had a better dynamic range, or a higher dynamic range, not necessarily better, than the AX8. So the compression is automatically going to be more subtle on the AX8, at least comparing the non-compressed one versus the compressed sample, which is probably why I like the FM3 better for that personally. But if you chose a different amplifier block that was already more compressed, had less dynamic range, you probably wouldn't have heard that big of a difference. The compressor pre-amplifier example, on the other hand, was a little more consistent. In fact, even the waveforms look more similar than the second test round does. So I think I was able to get them a little closer, probably because the amplifier models were closer. But there are some inherent differences between the minimum settings and maximum settings on both platforms that, will make the FM3 react faster and will make, different ranges of the frequency come in or get caught more quickly or more slowly. So there are still going to be fundamental differences just based off of the settings alone, not including the fundamental algorithms and the models they have built in. With that said, and this is one of those things that is very subjective and I have a hard time putting my finger on it, I find the compressors in the new gear to be more musical, just more satisfying to use. And I think a lot of that has to do not only with the under the hood optimizations having different models like the opticals and actual tube compressors, which is cool, but also because you have visual feedback. You have stuff like being able to change the side chain frequency response, which means you can make these compressors react to not just the full frequency range of your guitar, but individual bands. So if something starts getting spiky, or you have a particular note or range of your instrument that you want more compressed than the other, then you can kind of set that up, which is something you cannot do in the AX8. Now, I did not, again, show that here, but in practical usage, that is something I would highly recommend because it just makes it feel better. And even at the stock settings, I still feel like the FM3 feels better. And again, it probably isn't so much that only the compressor block was updated, it's everything in here has been updated. So you add on, a better drive block, a better compressor block, a really overhauled amplifier block, preamplifier on, the microphone that's going to the cabinet. And then, you got all these time-based effects we've not even talked about yet. Then all that stuff adds up to a package that's just like, oh, wow, this feels really polished now. And that's kind of where I feel like we're going to have to leave off for this video, because all of these things individually, they don't sound like a huge deal. I think the most important thing that I took away from this so far, and hopefully you will as well, especially as we get into the follow-up video, is that these things are not mutually exclusive. It's not that the work that Fractal Audio Systems is doing is not important. It totally is, as well as so many other amp modeling companies and technology in general. But when it comes to streamlining the guitar signal chain, making it sound the way we want it to, having all the quirks of all this analog gear, it is important. It is appreciated by people like you and me. Keep doing it because you can hear the differences. Doesn't necessarily mean it's always better or worse, but it is important. And I definitely will keep funding this kind of research and hardware when it gets put out. On the other hand, it's also not the end of the world if you play through gear that isn't up to this spec. It's also not the end of the world if you like stuff that doesn't necessarily sound this close to the original thing. I don't like the hyperbolic take from different sides where it's like, well, gear doesn't matter. Just play through a pod and, if you're just screw them, do it just because. And then I also don't like the other side of the argument. It's like, it's got to be exactly like a tube amplifier, and you got to have the latest firmware, and I'm going to buy the new thing every 2 years because it's automatically outdated. It's neither of those. It's just okay. What they're doing, what Fractal Audio Systems and again so many other companies are doing to push hardware forward and software, emulation, it is real work, and you can hear the fruits of their labor. On the other hand, it's not the biggest damn deal if your, rectifier model sounds just a slightly hair widths difference from the one that you have sitting on your shelf. That's all I'm saying. So there's going to be a ton more to go over with the time-based effects. It likely won't be the direct next video, but it will be within the next couple. So definitely stay tuned for that. I think it's going to result in some more interesting findings. But for now, we're back in it with the Fractal Audio universe. I'm all for it. And any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. We got a lot more in store, even if it takes me the rest of the year to get through them all. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.